Hey, all right. So we are still waiting for people to come join, but let's get started. We only have about 45 minutes or so. Alrighty. Well, it's great to have you all. Super exciting to have a great webinar prepared for you all today. So welcome. Happy Thursday. So Actual and 1.5 have helped put together this exciting webinar, Policy and Practice, What to Expect in Global Climate Policy and How to Use It to Your Advantage. How today is going to work, we have a few different topics to talk through. I'll go over that structure shortly, but we'll go through our slides that we've got today. If we get through 80% and have some good time to get some Q&A going, we want to make sure this is interactive as well. If you have questions that come up during the discussion, please just send them in the Zoom chat. We've got Julia who's aggregating them in the background, and the speakers will answer them at the end. But let's get started. So my name is Matthias Milbau. I'm a founding partner at 1.5. I'm really excited to be here presenting in front of you all. A little bit about 1.5. We're an advisory firm based in New York, focused on two sort of main things. One, climate advisory, helping organizations decarbonize their strategy and operations. The second hat we wear is the OPF Academy, which is more on the training side, where we have a 6-week cohort-based program where we get people from net zero to reporting to measurements to strategy in that 6-week period. To date, we've trained roughly 1,500 people in total with our training offerings. But yeah, great to be here. I'm going to pass it over to the actual team, to Justin, to introduce himself and Ella as well, and then we'll jump into the agenda. Justin.
Thanks, Matthias. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks to Matthias and the team at 1.5. We've been friends for a long time now, and are very aligned on our purpose and the value that we're trying to bring to the world, to make the world sustainable for us and future generations. We are the capital planning technology for sustainability and resilience. And what that really means is that we help companies invest in their own climate transformation. So moving beyond just compliance into actually changing their business practices in order to do better by the planet, and creating optionality for them with the technology that we have so that they can see what their choices are in order to create that transformation, and what the cost will be and what the return will be, in order to align that planning for them internally, but also with their business partners in the supply chain or other global B2B partners that they work with. So, and I'm here with my colleague, Ella, who is our head of policy. Ella, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi folks, it's great to be here today. So I head up the policy team here at Actual, and we are responsible for all things related to legislative and regulatory engagement, both on Actual's behalf as well as figuring out the tricky and kind of constantly changing regulatory environment that our customers face. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today.
Thanks, Ella. And Matthias, we'll give it back to you to kick us off. Thank you.
All right, incredible. Thank you so much, Justin and Ella. All right, well, let's get started. So today what we're going to cover, 4 distinct topics: fossil fuels and energy transition, disclosures and greenwashing, methane and supply chain. And for each of these areas, we hope to share what the outcomes of major climate conferences, give a little bit of an overview of each of these areas, talk about some of these 2024 climate-related policy trends that you should know about, and then really identifying the opportunities for CSOs, executives, corporations, and what you should do with these trends and outcomes. So to kick things off, would love to get an audience poll going. We've just got a couple questions for you to answer. What are you looking to get out of today's webinar, so we better understand what to prepare for? Okay, amazing. Almost got full participation. We'll wait another few seconds. All righty. Amazing. Going to end the poll there. Just sharing the results so everyone can see here. Yeah, looks like people are mostly trying to understand sort of what's happening policy and regulatory wise for 2024, understanding some of the key outcomes of COP28 in Davos. And there's a mystery box. Some people are here for nothing specific, just here to learn, which we love to see. Incredible. Alrighty. Well, hopefully we can address some of those answers that you're looking for in the next 40 minutes or so. So let's get started. So when we look at fossil fuels and the energy transition, the energy system is our largest lever in climate action. Right now, energy is roughly around 70% of global emissions, and this is where majority of this reduction is really needed to happen. Now, when we look at COP, it's really been influenced by fossil fuel-based country states in the recent past. And this consensus-based system has largely influenced where we actually have situated the negotiations. So Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, Dubai, Baku, these places have had large fossil fuel interests. And I think the economies of Egypt, 30% fossil fuel dependence, UAE, I think it was around 70%, and then Baku is roughly about 90% fossil fuel dependence. And so we do have this interesting consensus-driven climate theater that's unraveling in front of our eyes, which is really driving what the agenda's talked about. And it also impacts a little bit about this speed of which we can transition. Some of the areas of focus that are happening right now, really talking about phasing out of fossil fuels through novel mechanisms that have been set up. For example, the COP28 Coal Transition Accelerator to transition out coal. We also have some funds that have been set up, for example, the Altera Funds, a $250 billion fund that's been set up to accelerate the energy transition, but also take into account the global south as well. Another area of focus here is the energy transition being a metals transition. This will be covered in a little bit more detail in supply chain, but the energy transition really relies on some critical and commodity metals that we need to get to in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. For example, by 2030, we need to mine about 120 years worth of copper in order for us to successfully transition. As an example, that's a huge bottleneck that we need to take into consideration. We also see a lot of long-term investment that needs to happen for your 2035 and beyond, 2040 and beyond, for hard to decarbonize sectors that can't just go onto solar and wind energy. And then, of course, it's hard to talk about this space without talking about China, the largest player in this space, bar the US. They're reaching peak coal next year, and they will be peaking in fossil fuels 2 years from now as well. And that's going to really drive a lot of change in the space. So when we take a look at some of the top regulations that are impacting CSOs and executives that you should know about, of course, the IRA has to be top of this list here. And this is really catalyzing an overall investment in the energy transition. And of course, this is effective from 2022. We've seen about 7 billion of investments around hydrogen hubs, which has jump-started hydrogen infrastructure in 6 different regions in the US. And this was from an executive order in October 2023. Interestingly, we've seen California set to end oil and gas production as they start to phase out in the state of California. For example, we have no fracking permits by January 2024, so this last month, and no oil and gas production beyond 2045. This is driving a lot of change in the space. When we take a look at the EU, we've got some fascinating areas here as well. The EU is looking to, has recently revised their 2040 net zero target to 90%. So moving from 2050, this is effective as of 2024. And this is a really ambitious leadership in the climate space here. We've also seen a lot of onshoring and manufacturing in lots of different contexts. This is no different to what's happening in the climate space. The Net Zero Industry Act strengthens Europeans' spate of net zero technologies and all the different parts of their manufacturing capabilities, including components, technologies. This is effective as of last year and will change a lot of their manufacturing strength going forward. And when we take a look at what's happening at the latest conferences, COP28 and Davos in Switzerland earlier this year, about a month ago, we've seen a few different outcomes that are interesting to take into consideration. We have an agreement to transition away from fossil fuels, which was the largest and most well received statement that we heard around COP. There are some issues here with mixed signals about switching to clean energy, as we didn't really receive this full phase out in the negotiated text at the end of COP. What this shows in terms of long-term impacts is that we do have more investment certainty for clean energy, and it does seem to signal lower oil and gas investments. In fact, oil production and exploration has peaked quite a few years ago, which is an interesting statistic to add to this announcement here. Of course, there was the tripling of renewables production and doubling of energy efficiency pledge that was made at COP28. Now, in the short term, this looks like a rapid expansion of existing renewable energy. But in the long term, we hope to see this get to around 11,000 gigawatts by 2030. This is the minimum threshold that the agreement stipulates. And this would get us in line with Kingsmill Bonds from the Rocky Mountain Institute, his article on energy and what it recently says is that we are on track for a non-linear path of solar production. And this could get us to a threshold around 11,000 gigawatts of energy, which would roughly get us onto this net zero path. Hydrogen has been on everyone's lips in recent times, and we had a declaration on hydrogen really identifying certificates and market signals for scaling up renewable-based hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives products. If this is scaled, this is largely going to drive decarbonization of heavy emitter industries like steel, concrete, for example, that require really high combustion temperatures and can't use clean energy that we have available today. And then, of course, at Davos, generative AI and AI was definitely part of the discussion, driving a lot of different panels. Interestingly, from an energy transition perspective, this is going to drive a lot of productivity and efficiency gains in the energy transition space. For example, we have more efficiency and creativity tied to battery chemistry, for example, and the critical minerals that tie to building out more innovative, high capacity, better potential batteries for storage. So what does this mean for you as an executive, a CSO, or a corporation? Well, we're looking at some opportunities here that are interesting here. So one, invest in cleaner energy mix as part of your operations. This is certainly the lowest hanging fruit when we look at reducing your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And in the future, this will lead to long-term reduction of costs, certainly as renewables cost curves decline. It's important to think about your hiring as well. Take advantage of the energy transition by exploring hiring energy specialists to take advantage of this transition. Now, a lot of this will be related to reducing your product or operational emissions tied to your hotspots when you're doing your emissions measurements. But also this looks at engaging your supply chain and your value chain as you start to transform these. And this will be talked about a little bit in the supply chain section as well. I mentioned battery storage earlier. There's an opportunity here to continue to build out and invest in building your clean energy capabilities here. In the short term, looking at initial investment capex to install your energy infrastructure, but then in the future, we're integrating energy security into your business, as well as aligning your business model to reducing your scope 1 and 2 in line with this predicted net zero trajectory as well. Finally, exploring subsidies for clean energy alternatives is definitely on the table. We're going to talk a little bit about some disclosure and regulatory updates coming, which will be really useful for this section here. And identifying long-term offtake partners that can really help to guarantee demand for your clean energy alternatives, like hydrogen fuel, for example, is important here too. When we look at disclosures and greenwashing, there is really a focus on accountability and some upcoming regulation and greenwashing rules. So at the moment, the way that we are seeing this change, we're seeing a convergence of disclosure regimes. Now, at the moment, a lot of people are concerned about disclosure and that it's a large compliance issue, increasing cost unnecessarily. But this also provides an opportunity to tell the story about what you've been doing transparently and how you're embedding sustainability into your business operations through your disclosures. We also see that the noose is tightening around anti-greenwashing rules and regulations are certainly increasing as well. The areas of focus at the moment really are about maturing of greenhouse gas emissions reporting, especially around scope 3. For the first time, nature-based reporting through TNFD is being talked about. We are also seeing a lot of green claims being questioned, and there's some regulations I'll share in a second that are tied to this as well. Now, some of the key players here, I've got some logos that I've shared on this slide here. IFRS, which is tied to a large harmonization exercise around scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. They are connected to one of the two largest accounting bodies out there. And this is really important in terms of spearheading adoption across the globe as well. We have the EU driving a lot of regulation, and we have some organizations like the Financial Control Authority from the UK, TNFD as well, that are driving a lot of change in this space. Now, data and emissions modeling is becoming incredibly important to succeed in this space. So there's a few different players here that we're mentioning, Actual, for example, but Sphera, Persephone, we have SEMA Pro, EcoChain, and some other players that are definitely key players in this space. So for this slide here, we believe the EU is really the engine of this regulation wave that's coming. There's a few different regulations that are on this slide here. I'd love to just focus on two of them, the EU Greenwashing Directive proposal. This has been formally endorsed in January 2024 and should be in law coming up soon. This is really trying to tackle false environmental claims around greenwashing to help with specific claims around products, around eco-friendly, sort of climate neutral products, for example. These consumer labels have been fairly misleading, and this regulation here seeks to tighten that up quite significantly. We also have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that has been in the final text is expected fairly soon in spring 2024, with this being effective in a couple of years in 2026 or 2027. This is focused largely on making sure that corporates are conducting sort of an ESG diligence process on their own value chains, exploring human rights, exploring social issues, but also exploring environmental impacts of those value chains as well. This is driving a lot of change in the space. And as we've seen for the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is one of the first regulatory pieces out the gate around this topic. And then when we take a look at some other regions here, of course, we have the SEC climate risk disclosures that are dropping roughly around April or spring this year. This is going to require public companies to report certain climate-related disclosures around scope 1, 2, and maybe scope 3. We're going to see a lot of change in that. At the moment, we have quite a bit of litigation that's coming down to contest some of these potential overreaching rules from this agency, specifically around scope 3. That's what's been the delay. We were expecting this rule to come through halfway through last year, till delayed until the end of last year, and now we're seeing this coming through around spring or April this year. We do have California's two rulings that are in law now that are expected Jan 2026. And this is actually going to hold public and private companies accountable for emissions around scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This is for companies that are based in California or do business in California, which is going to drive a lot of disclosure requirements coming up. We have some more greenwashing regulation that's coming from the UK. The FCA's sustainability disclosure requirements are here. And then we also see, this is not a regulatory body, but IFRS, their sustainability and climate related disclosures, they are coming pretty soon. They've just started as of Jan 2024, with the idea to create a global baseline for sustainability disclosure standards that are proportionate, scalable, and used globally. And when we look at what happened at COP28 and Davos in this topic of disclosures and greenwashing, we're really seeing that the voluntary carbon markets have had a lot of controversy in terms of quality and integrity, but a joint framework was announced on the voluntary carbon market, the VCM. This certainly signals integrity, quality to the market, and hopefully will help with the price and controversies that have been faced by the market in the past year. Hopefully, what we'll also see in the long term is some much needed quality safeguards, integrity, and alignment. We're seeing nature being a huge topic of discussion, with about 300 companies committing to reporting on nature via the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures, TNFD. This is driving a lot of boards to take into account more nature and biodiversity related decisions. And of course, this is tying to what happened in Montreal in 2022 for COP15 to address these biodiversity goals, and also to reverse some of the global biodiversity loss as well. Finally, we're seeing a lot of convergence happening as this global baseline is established by the ISSB. Close to 400 organizations from 64 different jurisdictions have committed to using these ISSB standards. And what we'll see going forward is that they will put that into law. And this ideally sets up decades of, reverses decades of voluntary and disparate reporting, converges to a global consistent approach. So what kind of opportunities do you have as an executive CSO or corporation here? Well, you can certainly conduct product LCAs to really figure out what kind of regulatory claims can you make on your products, and also to meet your upcoming regulatory changes. In terms of long-term impacts, I want to stress that it's not just compliance, but you can also move to performance and identifying various product-specific innovations that address your hotspots of life cycle. Another opportunity we see as data becomes incredibly important, we've seen industries like the automotive industry and the fashion industry start to partner with industry coalitions and networks to help to share emissions data. This is naturally going to help to counter some of these greenwashing claims, making sure that this sharing of information increases granularity and also improves the accuracy of your own carbon footprints of your product, but also operations. The idea here is that it helps to drive standardization, a single approach to doing this, as well as updating regulatory readiness. Finally, as you're doing your LCAs, as you're improving your data granularity, you're also talking about it to the public. You're increasing your transparency, building credibility as a brand, especially with upcoming anti-greenwashing rules, making sure that you're sharing your climate project progress. In the long term, what we hope to see, there's an opportunity here to rise above green hushing, this concept that you are inhibiting yourself from communicating what you're doing in sustainability, and sort of waiting back behind the sidelines. But being in front of it, being transparent, talking about your story, and how your sustainability activities are being integrated into your business, and hopefully building customer loyalty. Great. I'm going to pass it over to the actual team to talk us through methane and supply chain.
Thank you, Matthias. We're going to pause here for a second. Really appreciate, Matthias, you sorting through everything that's come out of COP and Davos, which is a large volume of information, and then giving us the highlights from all of those different perspectives and domains. We'd like to pause here since the majority of you said that you're here to really hear what came out of COP and Davos. We'd love now to source some questions for you on anything that you heard from Matthias. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we'll give you the floor to begin that discussion. If you don't have questions, we have a lot more information that we're happy to share with you. So no pressure, but we would love to hear from you all.
I think we have a question
Great.
in the chat from Joseph. Yeah.
How can newbies in the sustainability? Yeah, great.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here with some thoughts.
Go ahead, Julia. You want to read it out for us?
Yeah, sure. I think I can answer the question. So the question is, how can newbies in the sustainability sector access job opportunities? Great question. There's a few different ways you can source. Certainly from an external perspective, you can take a look at the different jobs boards that are out there. We've got climatebase.org, which we are partner with. They're fantastic. They have a newsletter as well, which highlights the key jobs in the space. Certainly you can take a look at terra.do's job board as well. There's a lot of opportunities there as well. LinkedIn is getting there, but it's not perfect for identifying sustainability jobs at the moment. But you can, I believe, filter for green related jobs, and that's getting progressively better and better and better. And then, of course, naturally, like any other job opportunity, networking and going to events, going to webinars like this, identifying people in your network or just outside your network that you can talk to, introduce yourself to learn about more job opportunities in the space. Those are definitely my top sort of recommendations on finding a job in the sustainability sector.
Greenwashing. How can companies balance improving the systems while increasing production cost? Inelastic versus elastic goods. Ella or Matthias, do we need more context on that question? Or would one of you like to take that?
Yeah, can you, if you can elaborate on the question, that would be fantastic, just so I know how exactly you'd like to get this answered.
Yeah, sorry, I put the wrong typing, but what I mean by that is when companies, they are improving their systems, like, for example, clothing, they're without increasing production costs is what I'm trying to say. For, as an example, for food and beverage goods, right? Consumers only pay a particular price for that. However, there's a lot of byproducts that is outside the system. What I mean by that is plastic. So I'm just trying to understand, like greenwashing is like, hey, we can say this packaging is recyclable or sustainable. However, that's gonna increase the production cost pricing. And then, like for greenwashing, like, of course, the best ideal packaging have to be compostable, for example, but that costs a lot for companies to invest in. And trying to improve the systems, what I'm trying to say, right? Like system overall, in terms of recycling or composting. It's a complex topic, so I'm not sure we have an idea onto that.
Yeah, I can share some initial thoughts on this. I think there's sort of two perspectives here. One is specifically from the company side and one's from the industry side as well. From the company side, certainly you can identify the materials that potentially aren't recyclable, that are compostable, and you can increase your prices potentially to take into account more sustainable materials. The connection here in increasing your price is that these materials are probably a little bit more scarce. So recycled polyester, for example, versus virgin polyester. And so naturally, with a supply constrained resource, the price goes up, and therefore you'll have to increase your production costs. That's probably in the short term from a company perspective. You'll get penalized for, I guess, being unsustainable with these greenwashing regulations. In the longer term, we see the industry come into play here, where largely you have coalitions of food and beverage companies, for example, figuring out a longer term solution. So, for example, in Singapore, there's a consortium of investors invested into Circulate Capital, and they're an investment fund based in Singapore that's looking at essentially plastic waste and solutions around it. What they're doing is helping to source startups, to source investments into recycling infrastructure, for example, to help with more sustainable material production and recycled materials. So that's going to take a much longer time to change the entire system, but is an approach that's happening from that industry coalition perspective. So those are two different ways that people will take into account these changes for greenwashing, for example. But I think there's still this issue where we're trying to bake a new externality into pricing. We should expect price changes. How that's marketed and how companies actually roll that into their strategy is yet to be seen. So hopefully there'll be some creative ways where they can maintain their costs, reduce their costs in the future, but at the moment, likely in the short term, those costs will increase. But we'll see what happens from that. Does that answer your question?
If I could add, oh, sorry, Justin. But if I could add to respond to that question a little bit as well, I think another part of it is the role of both regulations and incentives that exist. So there are all sorts of regulatory developments, both of those that are currently implemented and those that are kind of in the pipeline, that will create all sorts of pressures that force companies towards different kinds of behaviors, towards different solutions and materials. And so while plastic is currently, for example, one of the cheapest materials with which they can work and to produce their products, that might not always be the case. There are countries that are increasingly making plastic a lot. You can't get a plastic bag. There's all sorts of requirements on drawing down the amount of plastic that's circulating within the economy. And so there will be incentives that encourage companies to move towards other materials. And then Leslie, just to kind of touch on your question as well about whether regulation is the main driver for corporations that we work with, or is it voluntary? It's a mixed bag, and it also depends upon where in the world corporations are based. So some countries or blocks like the EU have pretty robust regulatory regimes that are starting to be implemented. And so for them, it is really important that they're both in compliance, but also that they're producing products that, their customers want and meet the rules of where they exist and also where they export their goods to. So for those organizations, regulations are a really big driver, a really big source of pressures. There are other types of organizations, say like a tech company, that doesn't necessarily face those same pressures because most of their overhead is things like, computers, internet, data centers. So increasingly, they don't really face those same pressures. Matthias, or Justin, anything to add on the role of regulations and driving companies towards sustainable behavior?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add, and then we'll probably stay on a little longer if any folks want to stay until 10:02 or something like that, because we very much want to incorporate your perspectives and feedback, and also we have other information we want to share. But on the trade-offs between rising cost of doing things sustainably and consumer demand, I'm a human-centered designer, and so this consumer behavior is really interesting to track. Will consumers choose individual short-term goals over long-term collective goals? And will we see a shift in trend in that direction? And there are a lot of variables here, right? Like generational variables and certainly socioeconomic variables and things like that. But one thing that's interesting about the US consumer, and in my opinion, is that very individualistic, right? This is why, not to get on a soapbox or anything, but this is why, we still have individual gun collectively. It obviously has a very negative impact on society, right? So, but it's don't take away my individual rights, even if the collective impact is terrible, right? So similar things that companies are wrestling with around cost of improving their sustainability. If in the short term people can no longer to afford, fruits and vegetables, for example, because the rising cost of low emission refrigeration of those vegetables, it gets trickled down to the consumer. Will consumers actually care, or will they say, you know what, I need to eat this week and this month, and my family needs to eat, and therefore let's put off this, collective climate impact that we're trying to get to by 2040. That's something that companies watch for, and it's also something that I think we should pay attention to as consumers, because consumer collective action does have a real impact on company decision making, right? So certainly we want people to be able to afford to eat, right? But balancing the rising cost of implementing sustainable technology, for example, with whether or not consumers end up being the one paying for it, is something that I think, we could take collective action on. So that's how I view that question. Thank you all for jumping in. Ella, I'm going to kick it over to you now to give some more information out.
Yes. So folks, I am aware that we are getting close to time, and I want to be respectful of all of y'all's schedules. So if you do need to hop on the quarter hour, please do so. We will send out a recording with the rest of this. And if you are free to, if some more time, please feel free to hang around and we will get through the rest of this deck. So methane, as Matthias touched on earlier about fossil fuels and the significant role that they play in global warming, methane is another one of those really trouble spots. It currently accounts for about 18% of all greenhouse gases that are emitted, and the vast majority of that comes from fossil fuel infrastructure, so leaking pipelines, leaking wells, farms, and landfills. There have recently been all sorts of agreements and new regulatory developments that are seeking to limit methane leaks, as well as to better monitor those leaks so that they can hold organizations accountable. That includes via various fines, as well as incentive programs that are being implemented all around the world. And we'll talk about some of those specifically in a couple minutes. Main areas of focus for methane to look out for this year and over the next few years is some of these new detection methods, so including satellites. In the past, companies, oil and gas companies, for example, could just claim that they were ignorant of the amount of methane associated with their production because there weren't really good ways to monitor it. And satellites kind of make that point moot because they can very accurately detect the amount of methane coming from a certain oil field, for example, and the governments can fine accordingly. There are all sorts of incentives that exist to cap orphaned and abandoned wells, especially within the US. We're starting to see this, lots of funding and provisions to clean up those well sites and remediate the land. Environmental justice and health concerns. So a lot of the places that spew methane are pretty harmful to human health and environmental. They create a lot of environmental degradation. And so there are all sorts of initiatives to fund the cleaning up of these efforts in order to protect the environment as well as the people that live near these sites. And then experimenting with new ways to reduce agricultural emissions, especially within kind of the dairy and livestock sector. A lot of these key players in this space are energy companies as well as farms. As you can see by this sweet cow, about a third of all of these emissions are they come from agriculture. Some countries have a particularly big problem with this, New Zealand being one of them. The next slide. So some regulatory updates. The IRA, which has already been mentioned, is probably one of your climate friends' favorite bills of the last decade and will come up for a very long time. So the IRA aims to reduce the US's carbon emissions by about 40% by 2030. Among other things, it provides incentives to corporations to accelerate their transition to green energy sources. And most of the bill is really full of incentives, kind of things that give companies money in order to incentivize sustainable behavior and transition activities. But methane is one of the outliers in that, and that it is full of fining regimes for methane emissions. So if you have methane coming from your sites, you will be fined under this. So it turns what were previously just kind of stranded assets into active liabilities. Relatedly, the EPA has new methane rules. They're called the Methane Emissions Reduction Program, or MERP, incredibly. And this encourages the deployment of available technologies and development of new technologies to both reduce methane emissions as well as track those emissions. It comes with a couple-year phase-in period, so it'll be very, very active by 2026. And it also has a good chunk of funding, about $2 billion, was allocated by Congress to support monitoring programs to really make sure that we have really good sense of where these emissions are coming from so that we can identify remedies and crack down. New Zealand has a very unique methane tax. So New Zealand, just for a little bit of context, has about 5,000 people, but they have 10 million cows and 26 million sheep. So they have an awful lot of methane emissions coming from their agriculture sector. And this tax is designed to tax the methane emissions associated with livestock. It goes live at the end of 2025, and it is a bit of a controversial bill. The farming sector is pretty unhappy. They're worried about the effect it will have on their fleets of cattle and sheep, but the government is working really hard to identify valid ways to sequester carbon on farm and come up with ways to really make this feasible. And then lastly, the EU methane strategy. So this was pending as of November of last year. They reached a provisional agreement. And under the current version of the rule, oil and gas companies are going to be required to both report on their methane emissions and take steps in quite a timely manner, in some circumstances within 5 days, to remediate those emissions and to avoid them moving forward.
Ella, I just want to give a quick example here
Yes.
as we get to the time, because I think this is also relevant to the earlier question about sustainability jobs. In New Zealand, these are very complex stakeholder ecosystems. At Actual, Ella and I have been involved in some work with New Zealand wool farmers, and the challenge is net zero wool possible? Because sheep emit methane. So wool is a natural fiber. Natural benefits, but because sheep emit methane, how do you decrease the climate impact on farm? And so at Actual, we were able to team with a company called the New Zealand Reno Company, supplies like Allbird shoes and Icebreaker and Smart Wool and Helly Hansen and Fall Raven and just a bunch of like awesome outdoor apparel companies in Europe and the United States and elsewhere. And what we were able to find was that if you sequestered carbon through native planting, that if the entire network where there's land area available to plant plants, right, looking at the altitude of the farms and will plants survive, and water accessibility, even roads for a nursery to get in and put plants in the ground. But if you are able to plant all of the area that's eligible for planting and not being used for grazing, that the entire network of those 600 plus farms would become net zero by 2031. So that really helped the brand partners who are, buying wool from New Zealand to say, our net zero goals are possible, right? Just through this one on-farm mitigation through reforestation, native planting. Now, the challenge is the government then came out with this methane tax scheme that Ella was talking about. And that's not a challenge into itself. It's awesome that New Zealand is the leader in the world and coming up with new regulations in order to curb climate change, but based off of animal headcount. And if you're a farmer and you decide that you want to cut the number of animals you have in order to not be fined for your methane emissions, you cut too many animals, you no longer have a viable farm. So because we had already mapped and calculated this this mitigation through soil sequestration of carbon, we at Actual are able to join in the conversations with New Zealand wool growers and the New Zealand government to say, hey, if soil sequestration is a possibility to lower methane emissions or sequester carbon, then could that also be built into the methane tax? And we showed them the work that we'd done so far, and the government said, yes, actually, if you can, if it's scientifically backed and we can inspect the models, which everything on our platform is, then that can be part of it as well, right? So there's a lot of opportunity in the space between the different stakeholders involved, right? In this case, family-owned farms that have been passed down for generations, through to the brands that, buy that material and then incorporate it into their products. And when you're looking at like your careers in sustainability, for some of you, there's certainly organizations, like actual and other new companies that are working directly in this arena. There's also a lot of potential jobs. I absolutely love Albert Shoes. They're based in San Francisco and growing. And they, track all of these things and do the reporting for the company. So there's a lot of companies like that, but there's also really opportunity down at the granular level, like for us working with the growers and working with New Zealand Merino that has its own sustainability team that works directly with the growers. So think about the opportunities across that global supply chain. It's a very exciting space. And some of the solutions that, we have to get to, again, it's about creating the collective solution rather than just asking one group in that ecosystem to take on the burden of the change alone. I just don't think the collective change we need is going to happen if we approach it in that sort of binary, more competitive way. It's actually that once everyone understands the problem and the opportunity to solve, then everyone can understand their role in coming together to solve that problem, right? And that collective action is actually what's going to turn the corner for us. At least that's what I believe. So anyway, I just wanted to share that quick example to give you some insight into how this shows up in the world from our experience.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Justin. I think that's also a really good example of what implementation needs to look like and be considered when developing policy. A lot of the time, policy development is what is seen as the fun part, and implementation is the unfun part, but it's really, really important to take into consideration when developing policy and talking about whether or not it's successful. To keep us moving along. So a little bit of information about what came out of COP in Davos this year. So the Global Methane Pledge, which was born in 2022, saw a lot more attention this last COP. Now over 150 countries have signed on, including most recently Canada, Japan, Germany, Turkmenistan, among others. This pledge countries commit to reducing methane emissions by about 30% within the next 6 years. So the short-term impacts of this are that states have to go home and make their own methane rules and regulations in order to make this happen. And then ultimately, the hope is that these regulations and fines will lead to the utilization and development of new technologies and result in long-term methane emissions declines. The Green Climate Fund and private sector investments represent lots and lots of funding being thrown at making sure that there are new technologies and remediation efforts that can support the drawdown of methane emissions across all sorts of economies and geographies. The Dairy Methane Action Alliance is a really interesting example of private corporations coming together in order to build a coalition that is really targeted at reducing their emissions. So this group, led by General Mills, Kraft, and Nestle, among others, was convened under the Environmental Defense Fund. And their goal is to set a new standard for accountability and transparency when it comes to their emissions and work on farm across their supply chain to reduce those emissions, which is a really big deal for a company, say like Nestle, to really have conversations with farmers about what interventions they can implement in order to reduce their emissions all up and down their supply chain. And then the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. This was exciting progress to see. So about 50 oil and gas companies around the world joined this charter, and their goal is to get to net zero by about 2050. They have goals around, investing in renewables and lots of monitoring and reporting. It represents progress and recognition that this is important, but, a lot of oil and gas companies didn't sign the charter, and the commitments are non-binding and relatively narrow in scope. So progress, but a little bit toothless.
Amazing. Thank you, Ella, and thank you, Justin. Just given the time that we have on the clock at the moment, we might wrap up for the day. We do have all your lovely details, so we can send through the rest of the slides. you'll have this recording as well sent through, and a couple of the resources that we sourced to put these slides together as well. I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of 1.5 and Actual for joining today. It's been a fantastic session hearing about some of the important updates in the regulatory space and how that could potentially impact you in the sector. Thank you so much, Ella. Justin, any final words from you?
Thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Matthias.
Absolutely.
Thank you, 1.5. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Ella. Thank you, Actual. And thank you for joining. Fantastic. We'll wrap things up here. Have a great rest of the day.